"We've seen your type before," the judge said, his voice dripping with contempt. "Angry, old and useless." The courtroom fell silent, every eye fixed on the elderly man standing at the witness podium. His weathered hands trembled slightly against the wooden rail. Malcolm Brewer didn't flinch. He simply straightened his hunched back, a perfect military posture suddenly emerging from his frail frame. Then, with precision that belied his 73 years, he raised his right hand in a flawless salute. "Yes, Your Honor," he replied, voice steady as stone. Judge Arthur Kensington's mouth twitched with annoyance. "This isn't the military, Mr. Brewer. Save your theatrics." Malcolm lowered his hand slowly. The sleeves of his threadbare jacket rode up slightly, revealing a jagged scar that wrapped around his wrist like a bracelet. "I apologize, sir," Malcolm said quietly. "Old habits." The judge shuffled through his papers, not bothering to look up. "You're here as a character witness for this. A veteran's home case. What could you possibly contribute that isn't clouded by your obvious bias and—" He gestured vaguely at Malcolm's shaking hands. "Condition?" In the gallery, someone coughed uncomfortably. The court reporter's fingers hovered over her keyboard, hesitant. Malcolm stood perfectly still now. His eyes, sharp blue against his sun-worn face, didn't waver. "I only came to speak the truth, Your Honor." The judge scoffed. Truth from a janitor. How illuminating. But in the second row of the gallery, a young woman in a tailored suit leaned forward suddenly. Her eyes narrowed on the small, worn pin affixed to Malcolm's lapel, easily missed, purposefully discreet. She recognized it instantly, and what the judge didn't know about the man he was dismissing was about to change everything. His name was Lieutenant Colonel Malcolm James Brewer, United States Army Special Forces, retired. In the spring of 2003, while most of America watched shock and awe footage of Baghdad on their television screens, Malcolm led a team of 11 operators into the mountains of northern Afghanistan. Their mission was classified. Officially, they were never there. A diplomatic compound had been overrun. 17 American and Allied personnel were trapped inside a reinforced panic room with dwindling oxygen and no extraction plan. Intelligence suggested they had less than 6 hours before the door would be breached. Malcolm's team dropped under cover of darkness 2 miles from the target. No air support, no backup, just 11 men carrying enough ammunition to last 20 minutes in a sustained firefight. "We'll be dead in 10, his communications officer had whispered as they moved through the shadows of the valley. Malcolm just nodded once and kept walking. The compound was surrounded by 53 hostiles. Malcolm counted each one through his scope, memorizing positions, cataloging weapons. He didn't rush. Patience had saved his life 17 times before. It would save 17 more lives that night. At 0200 hours, Malcolm split his team. 4 men created a diversion at the south entrance, bright, loud, violent. The remaining 7, led by Malcolm himself, slipped in through a drainage tunnel his intelligence officer had spotted on their thermal imaging. They moved through the compound like ghosts. 9 minutes, 11 targets neutralized. No radio communication, just hand signals and the language of men who had trained together so long they could read each other's breathing. When they reached the panic room, Malcolm used the blood from a cut on his own palm to draw a familiar pattern on the door, a sign known only to diplomatic security personnel. Inside, a young security officer recognized it immediately. The door opened just enough for Malcolm to slide a note inside. "We are Americans. Be ready to move in 30 seconds. Stay low." What happened next became legend among special operators, though no official record ever acknowledged it. Malcolm's team formed a human corridor through the building's east wing. They moved the diplomats through in pairs, each protected by operators on all sides. One of those diplomats was Richard Wilson, a mid-level State Department official with a wife and young daughter waiting back home. Halfway through the corridor, a grenade rolled into their path. Malcolm saw it first. Without hesitation, he pushed Wilson aside and threw himself onto the explosive, twisting to position his reinforced plate carrier to absorb the blast. The grenade was defective. It detonated with only half its intended force. Malcolm survived, but shrapnel tore through his lower back and legs. Still, he refused evacuation until every diplomat was secure. As the last helicopter lifted off, Malcolm remained on the ground, directing covering fire despite blood soaking through his uniform. Richard Wilson was the last person Malcolm helped board. He gripped the young diplomat's hand and said only, "Tell your family you love them. Nothing else matters." Malcolm spent 8 months in recovery. The scars never fully healed. His right leg retained shrapnel the doctors couldn't safely remove. His hands developed a permanent tremor from nerve damage, but he returned to duty for 3 more deployments before his retirement. No medals were ever officially awarded for the mission. The file was sealed, the operation denied. Malcolm received a handshake from his commanding officer and a transfer to a desk role. But in the decades since, Malcolm Brewer carried something else with him, something invisible to most but heavier than any medal. He carried the weight of lives saved and lost. He carried nightmares that woke him at 200 hours every night, right when that mission had begun. He carried the knowledge that 17 families still had their loved ones because of decisions he made in darkness. And now in this courtroom, standing before a judge who saw only an old man with shaking hands, Malcolm carried himself with the same quiet dignity he always had. After retirement, Malcolm Brewer disappeared by choice. No memoir, no speaking circuit, no veterans parades where he marched front and center. He settled in Lakeside, a small town where nobody asked about the scars. He took the job as courthouse janitor 5 years ago, not because he needed the money. His pension was modest but sufficient, but because the routine gave his days structure. The work gave his hands purpose. And the courthouse, with its rhythms of justice sought and sometimes found, reminded him of order in a world that often seemed to have forgotten it. Every Tuesday and Thursday, Malcolm volunteered at Veterans Haven, a struggling residential facility where men who had once commanded platoons now struggled to command their own memories. He didn't counsel them officially, he just sat with them. Sometimes they played chess. Sometimes they stared at the wall together in a silence civilians could never understand. One resident, Thomas Green, had served as a helicopter pilot during Malcolm's era. His mind was slipping away piece by piece, but on his good days he would look at Malcolm with sudden clarity and ask, "Do I know you from somewhere?" Malcolm always smiled and said, "Just a familiar face, Tom." The truth was, Thomas had been the extraction pilot for that mission in 2003. He'd never seen Malcolm's face, only heard his voice over the radio, guiding the helicopters in through heavy fire. But Malcolm recognized him instantly the first day he walked into Veterans Haven. The courthouse staff barely noticed Malcolm. He was just the old man who emptied trash bins and mopped floors after hours. Judge Kensington passed him in the hallway every day without a nod or glance. The security guards sometimes made jokes about his limp when they thought he couldn't hear. Probably some bar fight 30 years ago, one would say. "Nah, just getting old," another would reply. "Happens to the best of us." Only Ella, the night clerk, treated him with particular kindness. She left him homemade cookies sometimes with notes that said, "Thank you for your service." Malcolm assumed she wrote the same note to all veterans. He never realized she'd recognized the pin on his lapel, a small, unobtrusive emblem that most civilians would miss. But that marked him as part of a unit so classified, its name changed every decade. When Veterans Haven faced budget cuts and potential closure, it was Malcolm who organized the petition. Malcolm who sat in the back of town council meetings taking careful notes. Malcolm who finally approached Claire Wilson, a young prosecutor known for taking pro bono cases, and asked if she might help. "It's not just a building," he told her quietly, his voice carrying the gravity of someone who knew loss intimately. "For some of these men, it's the last place where anyone remembers who they once were." Claire took the case, impressed by the old janitor's articulate passion. She never asked about his background, never wondered why his assessments of the legal challenges were so incisive. She just assumed he was a concerned citizen with a soft spot for veterans. When the case finally reached Judge Kensington's courtroom, Malcolm agreed to testify about conditions at the facility. He arrived early, wearing the only suit he still owned, slightly too large now for his frame, shoulders dusted with disuse. He sat in the back row watching the proceedings with military attention to detail. As his name was called, he rose slowly, managing his pain with practiced dignity. The walk to the witness stand felt longer than the miles he'd once marched through mountain passes, but he kept his eyes forward, his posture as straight as his damaged spine would allow. The judge looked down at Malcolm from his elevated bench, not seeing a decorated officer, not seeing a man who had saved 17 lives in a single night, not seeing the nightmares that still woke him or the scars hidden beneath his clothing. Judge Kensington saw only what he expected to see, an aging janitor, presumptuous enough to think his testimony mattered, and that's when he spoke the words that would change everything. "We've seen your type before, angry, old, and useless." In the gallery, a door opened silently. A figure in a tailored suit slipped in and took a seat in the back row. No one noticed him yet. No one except Malcolm, whose situational awareness had never dulled with age. Malcolm recognized him instantly, though they had never formally met. The man was Admiral James Harrison, now chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and suddenly, Malcolm understood why he was there. Someone had finally connected the dots. "Your Honor," Claire Wilson stood abruptly, her voice cutting through the tension. "May I approach the bench?" Judge Kensington frowned. "Make it quick, Counselor." As Claire moved forward, her eyes caught the small pin on Malcolm's lapel again. It wasn't decorative, it wasn't ceremonial. It was identification, specific, deliberate, and recognized only by those who needed to know. She leaned in close to the judge, whispering urgently. The judge's expression shifted from irritation to confusion. "What exactly are you suggesting, Ms. Wilson?" he asked, no longer whispering. Claire straightened. "I'm requesting permission to establish the witness's credentials differently." The judge waved his hand dismissively. "Proceed, though I doubt the janitor's credentials will impress this court." Claire turned to Malcolm, her eyes filled with a new understanding. "Mr. Brewer," she began, voice steady, "could you please tell the court your full name and former occupation?" Malcolm hesitated, eyes briefly flicking to the back of the courtroom where Admiral Harrison sat watching. A slight nod from the Admiral. "Permission granted. Lieutenant Colonel Malcolm James Brewer," he said, his voice suddenly carrying the unmistakable command presence that had once guided men through impossible missions. "United States Army Special Forces, retired." A ripple moved through the courtroom. The court reporter's fingers froze over her keyboard. "And could you please tell us," Claire continued, "if you've had any prior experience with diplomatic security protocols?" Malcolm's gaze remained steady. "I have." "Could you elaborate?" Malcolm paused. 2 decades of classified operations weighed in that silence. Then, "I led extraction teams for diplomatic personnel in compromised situations. The specifics of those operations remain classified." Judge Kensington's eyebrows rose slightly. He leaned forward, suddenly interested. Claire nodded, then walked to her briefcase. She removed a photograph and approached the witness stand. "Do you recognize this man?" she asked, showing Malcolm the picture. Malcolm studied it briefly. "Yes, that's Richard Wilson, State Department, circa 2003. Claire's voice softened. "Richard Wilson was my father." The courtroom collectively held its breath. "My father died last year," Claire continued, "but before he passed, he wrote letters to my mother and me. He said that on April 17, 2003, he was trapped in a diplomatic compound in northern Afghanistan. He described how a team of special operators rescued him and 16 others." She turned to face the gallery. "He wrote that their team leader took a grenade blast that should have killed my father. That man refused evacuation until every diplomat was safe. My father never learned his name. The mission was classified, but he described a distinctive scar pattern on the man's right wrist, where he'd shielded my father from shrapnel." Claire gently reached for Malcolm's arm. With his permission, she carefully rolled back his sleeve, revealing the jagged scar that wrapped around his wrist. "This is the man who saved my father's life," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the courtroom. "This is why I'm alive today, why I had 20 more years with my father." The judge's face had drained of color, but before he could speak, movement at the back of the courtroom drew everyone's attention. Admiral James Harrison stood, his uniform adorned with the insignia of his office. The gallery parted as he walked forward, his footsteps echoing in the silence. "Your Honor," he said, voice measured but commanding, "I request permission to address this court." Judge Kensington, suddenly looking very small behind his bench, nodded mutely. The Admiral approached the witness stand. Malcolm automatically began to rise, military protocol ingrained despite the years. "At ease, Colonel," Harrison said quietly. Then, louder, "For the record, I am Admiral James Harrison, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. I'm here to confirm that Lieutenant Colonel Malcolm Brewer's service record is one of the most distinguished in modern military history." He turned to face the courtroom. "Most of what he did for this country remains classified, but I can tell you this. The operation, Ms. Wilson referenced did occur. 17 American and Allied personnel were extracted under impossible conditions with 0 casualties. Lieutenant Colonel Brewer was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions, though the ceremony was conducted privately due to the classified nature of the operation." The Admiral's gaze swept the courtroom, landing finally on Judge Kensington. After his military service, Colonel Brewer served as a senior advisor to 3 administrations on counter-terrorism strategy. His analysis and planning prevented no fewer than 7 major terrorist attacks on U.S. soil between 2010 and 2018. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Malcolm sat perfectly still, eyes forward, expression unchanged. When he retired from that position, Admiral Harrison continued, he declined all public recognition. He chose to live quietly, to serve in ways that would never make headlines. The Admiral turned back to Malcolm, his voice softening with something like reverence. Some of the finest men I've ever known choose to disappear when their service ends. They don't seek parades, they don't write memoirs, they find simple ways to continue serving without recognition. Then, with deliberate formality, Admiral Harrison raised his hand in a perfect salute. It has been my honor to serve in the same military as you, Colonel Brewer. And just like that, something extraordinary happened. One by one, people throughout the courtroom stood. First, a bailiff near the door, a former Marine by his bearing. Then an elderly court reporter, a young lawyer in the second row. Within moments, the entire courtroom was on its feet. Not because they were ordered to, not because protocol demanded it, but because they suddenly understood what had been sitting among them, unrecognized all along. And if you had listened closely in that moment, you might have heard the sound of truth breaking through the surface of assumption, a quiet reminder that greatness doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just sweeps the floors after everyone else has gone home. Judge Arthur Kensington had been on the bench for 27 years. In that time, he had faced down organized crime bosses, corrupt politicians, and once a defendant who lunged at him with a makeshift knife. Never, in all those years, had he looked as thoroughly shaken as he did now. His hands trembled slightly as he removed his glasses. The courtroom remained standing, a sea of faces turned not toward him, but toward the elderly man in the witness box, the janitor who turned out to be something else entirely. "The court will take a 15-minute recess," Kensington announced, his voice lacking its usual authority. As he rose to leave, he paused, looking directly at Malcolm for what seemed like the first time. "Colonel Brewer," he said, the title falling awkwardly from lips unaccustomed to showing deference. "My chambers, please." Malcolm nodded once, the gesture neither subservient nor challenging, just acknowledgement. In the gallery, people began to whisper, as Malcolm was escorted not through the main doors, but through the judge's private entrance. Claire Wilson watched, her case notes forgotten in her hands. The revelation of Malcolm's identity had changed everything, not just for the courtroom, but for her. "He never told me," she whispered to her co-counsel, "all those meetings about Veterans Haven, and he never once mentioned—" Her voice trailed off as Admiral Harrison approached. "He wouldn't have mentioned it," the Admiral said quietly. "Men like Malcolm don't measure their worth by what they've done. They measure it by what they continue to do." Inside the judge's chambers, Malcolm stood at parade rest by instinct, hands clasped behind his back. Judge Kensington sat heavily in his leather chair, the weight of his error visible in the slump of his shoulders. "I owe you an apology, Colonel," he began. Malcolm shook his head slightly. "No, Your Honor, you don't." Kensington looked up, surprised. "What I said was inexcusable," he insisted. "You made a judgment based on the information you had," Malcolm replied. "I've done the same many times, sometimes with higher stakes." A silence stretched between them, the judge struggling to reconcile the janitor who emptied his trash with the soldier who had saved lives and shaped national security. "Why?" Kensington finally asked. "Why work as a janitor here? With your background, your connections—" Malcolm's eyes shifted to the window, looking past the courthouse grounds to the mountains in the distance. "When you've lived the life I have," he said slowly, "you come to value different things. Quiet, routine, being part of something ordinary." He paused, choosing his words with care. "And perhaps redemption." Kensington's brow furrowed. "Redemption? For what? By all accounts, you're a hero." Malcolm's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes darkened. "I've made decisions that saved lives," he said. "I've also made decisions that took them. Both weigh equally at night." The judge fell silent, suddenly aware he was in the presence of a man who had carried burdens he couldn't begin to imagine. "This case," Malcolm continued, his focus returning to the present. "Veterans Haven isn't just a facility. For some of those men, it's the only place where they're still the person they remember being." Kensington nodded slowly. "I understand that now." He reached for a folder on his desk, opening it to reveal the Veterans Haven case file. "I've been given information that the opposing counsel has been less than forthcoming about the facility's finances," he said. "There appears to be evidence of misappropriation of funds intended for veteran care." Malcolm wasn't surprised. He'd suspected as much from his own quiet observations. "I'm recusing myself from this case," Kensington continued. and I'm recommending a full investigation into the management company." He closed the folder with finality. Sometimes justice needs fresh eyes not clouded by preconceptions. Malcolm nodded once, understanding the deeper meaning. Then, after a moment's hesitation, he extended his hand across the desk. Judge Kensington stood and took it, the gesture bridging more than physical distance. When they returned to the courtroom, something had shifted. The gallery fell silent as Malcolm walked back to the witness stand, not with the hesitant gait of before, but with the measured steps of a man who had carried responsibility across continents. Judge Kensington addressed the court with humility few had ever heard in his voice. "This court has been presented with extraordinary circumstances," he began. "I am recusing myself from further proceedings in this matter and recommending immediate injunctive relief for Veterans Haven pending a full investigation." He paused, his gaze sweeping the courtroom before settling on Malcolm. "This court also wishes to acknowledge an error in judgment. Colonel Brewer, your testimony today and your service to this country deserve nothing less than our profound respect." The opposing counsel began to object, but Kensington silenced him with a look. "The dignity of this court," he continued, "has been elevated today by the presence of a man who reminds us that true worth cannot be measured by appearance or title." As the proceedings concluded, Malcolm rose to leave. He didn't rush, didn't seek attention, simply gathered his worn coat and prepared to exit as quietly as he had entered. But the courtroom wouldn't let him. As he reached the gallery rail, Thomas Green, the helicopter pilot from Veterans Haven, stepped forward, his aged hand trembling as he raised it in salute. "I remember your voice now," he said, clarity breaking through his usual confusion. "You called us in through the fog. You brought us home." One by one, others joined him. Not just veterans, ordinary citizens, court staff who had passed Malcolm in hallways for years without really seeing him. Malcolm didn't speak. He simply nodded to each person, acknowledging their gesture with the same quiet dignity that had defined his life. Outside the courthouse, reporters had already gathered, alerted by the unusual presence of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs at a routine hearing. They surged forward as Malcolm emerged, cameras flashing, questions overlapping. "Colonel Brewer, how does it feel to be recognized after all these years? Will you continue working as a janitor now that your identity is known? Is it true you saved 17 diplomats in a classified operation?" Malcolm paused at the top of the courthouse steps, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the plaza. Admiral Harrison stood at his side, a silent barrier between Malcolm and the press. For a moment it seemed Malcolm might not speak at all. Then his voice carried across the crowd with the same quiet authority that had once guided men through darkness. "I'm just a man who did his duty," he said simply. "No different from thousands of others who serve without recognition every day." A reporter pressed forward. "But don't you want credit for your heroism? Don't you want people to know your story?" Malcolm looked at the young man, seeing in him the same hunger for drama and glory that so often missed the point of service entirely. "My story?" he echoed. "My story is the same as every man and woman who puts on a uniform. We serve. Some return, some don't. The lucky ones find peace." He glanced back at the courthouse, at the place where he had swept floors and emptied trash bins without complaint. "True heroism," he continued, "isn't about one dramatic moment captured on camera. It's about showing up day after day, doing what needs to be done whether anyone notices or not." With that, he nodded once to the crowd and began descending the steps, not toward the clamoring reporters, but toward a simple sedan parked at the curb where Claire Wilson waited, door open. As he settled into the passenger seat, Claire turned to him with eyes still bright with revelation. "All those meetings we had about Veterans Haven," she said. "All those times you helped me prepare this case. You could have told me who you were." Malcolm's weathered face creased in a small smile. "I told you what mattered," he replied. "That those men deserve better than being forgotten." Claire nodded slowly, understanding finally dawning. "Where to now?" she asked, starting the engine. Malcolm looked out the window at the courthouse, at the place where he had been invisible for years and would now never be anonymous again. "Veterans Haven," he said simply. "Thomas will be wondering where I am. We have a chess game scheduled." As they pulled away from the curb, the crowd of reporters and onlookers parted like water. Some still called questions, some just watched in silence. And in that moment, something rare happened in a world obsessed with fame and recognition, true respect. Not for what Malcolm had once been, but for who he had chosen to become. A man who understood that sometimes the greatest service happens in the quietest spaces, invisible to all except those who truly see. 3 months later, the sign outside Veterans Haven received a fresh coat of paint. The facility itself had undergone transformation. New windows, repaired roof, medical equipment that actually worked. A garden bloomed where weeds had once claimed the yard. The changes weren't just cosmetic. A full investigation had revealed years of financial mismanagement. With new leadership and proper funding restored, Veterans Haven had become what it was always meant to be, a place of dignity for those who had served. Malcolm still visited twice a week, still played chess with Thomas, still sat in comfortable silence with men whose stories mirrored parts of his own. But things had changed for him too. He no longer worked as the courthouse janitor. Instead, at Admiral Harrison's request, he had reluctantly accepted a position advising the Veterans Affairs Department on reform initiatives. His office remained spartanly furnished. No medals on display, no photographs with dignitaries, just a simple desk where he reviewed proposals with the same methodical attention he had once given to mission plans. One September morning, as autumn painted the mountains with copper and gold, Malcolm received a visitor. Judge Arthur Kensington stood awkwardly in the doorway of his modest office, a file folder clutched in his hands. "Colonel," he said by way of greeting, "do you have a moment?" Malcolm gestured to the chair opposite his desk. "Of course, Your Honor." Kensington sat, placing the folder between them. "The Veterans Haven case prompted me to review similar situations throughout the district. I've found concerning patterns." Malcolm nodded, unsurprised. "Systems fail when we stop seeing the people they're designed to serve." "Yes," Kensington agreed, opening the folder. "That's precisely why I'm here." They spent the next hour reviewing cases, identifying facilities where veterans received substandard care, discussing structural changes that might prevent such failures in the future. As they worked, the formal tension between them gradually eased. When they finished, Kensington closed the folder and sat back in his chair, studying Malcolm with new eyes. "May I ask you something personal, Colonel?" Malcolm inclined his head slightly. "Permission granted. That day in my courtroom, when I—" Kensington paused, still uncomfortable with the memory of his own behavior. "When I spoke to you so dismissively, you could have identified yourself immediately. You could have put me in my place. Why didn't you?" Malcolm considered the question, his gaze drifting to the window where mountains stood eternal against the changing sky. "In my experience," he said finally, "a man's character isn't revealed by how he treats those he respects. It's revealed by how he treats those he doesn't." Kensington absorbed the words, their weight settling on him like judgment and grace intertwined. "I've thought about that day often," he admitted, "about how easily we dismiss people based on appearance, age, status, how much we miss when we stop looking beyond the surface." Malcolm nodded. "It's a common failing in war and peace. We see what we expect to see. And yet, you chose to become invisible," Kensington observed, "a decorated officer working as a janitor. Why?" Malcolm's expression softened slightly. Not quite a smile, but something gentler than his usual reserve. "After decades of service where every decision carried life or death consequences, there's a certain peace in simple work," he explained. "In knowing that at the end of each day things are cleaner than when you began, more orderly, better in small ways most people never notice." Kensington nodded slowly, beginning to understand. "Besides," Malcolm continued, "true service has never been about recognition. It's about doing what needs to be done, regardless of who's watching." As Kensington rose to leave, he extended his hand across the desk once more. "Thank you, Colonel. Not just for today, but for teaching an old judge that wisdom sometimes sweeps the floors while fools sit on benches." After Kensington departed, Malcolm remained at his desk, watching sunlight move across the mountains. He thought about the men at Veterans Haven, about Claire Wilson, who now visited regularly to play chess with residents, about the courthouse where someone new now kept the floors clean. He thought about all the invisible people who held the world together, the ones who showed up day after day without fanfare or recognition, the ones who served not for glory, but because service itself was the point. In his desk drawer lay a letter from the White House, inviting him to a ceremony where the president wished to present him with the Presidential Medal of Freedom. He hadn't answered yet, probably wouldn't. Such gestures, well-intentioned as they were, missed the deeper truth he'd learned over decades of service. True worth isn't measured in medals or public acclaim. It's measured in lives touched, in quiet acts of dignity that may never be witnessed or recorded. It's measured in the courage to keep showing up, especially when no one notices, and perhaps most importantly, it's measured in the wisdom to see beyond appearances, to recognize that the old man with trembling hands might be carrying a lifetime of service beneath his weathered exterior, that the janitor quietly sweeping courthouse floors might have once commanded respect in corridors of power. That dignity doesn't diminish with age or status, it only deepens. As evening shadows lengthened across his office, Malcolm gathered his coat and prepared to leave. Tomorrow he would visit Veterans Haven again. Thomas would be waiting for their chess game. Life would continue in its new rhythm. And somewhere, perhaps, another old soldier was quietly sweeping floors, carrying memories of valor that no one could see, but that had shaped the world nonetheless. Some heroes are celebrated with parades and monuments. Others simply live lives of quiet dignity, invisible to most but no less essential. The greatest among them might be the ones we pass without noticing until someone takes the time to truly see. And in that seeing, we might just glimpse what courage really looks like when the uniforms are hung away and the medals are put in drawers. It looks like an old man with trembling hands, standing tall when disrespected. It looks like service that continues long after the spotlight has moved elsewhere. It looks like dignity that needs no audience to sustain it. It looks like Malcolm Brewer. This wasn't the last time someone underestimated the wrong man, and if you want to hear more, you're in the right place. We walk past them every day, in courthouses and coffee shops, on park benches and in grocery store aisles, men and women who once stood in the gap between danger and safety, who made decisions that saved lives, who carried burdens we can hardly imagine. Now they carry groceries. They sweep floors. They sit quietly in the back of rooms where younger voices dominate. We see their age, their trembling hands, their slowing gait. What we don't see is the courage that never aged, the sacrifice that never sought recognition, the service that continued long after uniforms were hung away. Maybe that's the true measure of character, not what we do when everyone is watching, but who we continue to be when no one is watching at all. Not the glory captured in headlines, but the dignity maintained in silence. How many Malcolm Brewers have you passed today without seeing? The elderly man at the bus stop with scarred hands, the quiet woman who always holds the door, the veterans whose stories remain untold because no one thought to ask. Their valor didn't end when the mission was complete. It just took different forms. Perhaps true respect isn't about saluting those in uniform. It's about recognizing the service that continues without one. It's about seeing beyond appearances to the character beneath. Because in a world obsessed with fame and recognition, there is something profoundly powerful about those who continue serving without either. Leave a comment below about someone in your life, a veteran, a teacher, a parent, whose quiet service deserves recognition. Share this story if you believe that some heroes don't need capes or medals to change the world. And if this story moved you, subscribe. There are more untold stories waiting, more invisible heroes whose dignity shines brightest when we take the time to truly see. Remember, the most extraordinary people often look the most ordinary until someone looks deeper.